I'm sure you'd like, on all our behalves, to extend a welcome to the families for Justice for the Forgotten who are joining us.
Absolutely. You're all most welcome.
Ceann Comhairle, this week marks the 50th anniversary of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. Friday, May the 17th, 1974, remains a date marked deep in the psyche of our nation, etched in unimaginable pain and loss, prolonged by a searing injustice. At 5:30 p.m. on that early summer's evening, 3 no-warning car bombs ripped through the centre of Dublin, at Talbot Street, Pearse Street, and at the junction of Nassau Street and South Leinster Street. At approximately 7 p.m, 84 miles away in Monaghan town, a 4th car bomb exploded. 33 people and an unborn baby were killed. In August, baby Martha O'Neill was stillborn at full term. It was the most people killed in any one day of the conflict. And their names were Patrick Askin, aged 44, County Monaghan; Josie Bradley, aged 21, County Offaly; Marie Butler, 21, County Waterford; Anne Byrne, 35, Dublin; Thomas Campbell, aged 52, County Monaghan; Simone Chétry, 30, France; Thomas Crocran, 36, County Monaghan; John Dargill, aged 80, Dublin; Concepta Dempsey, aged 65, County Louth; Colette Doherty, aged 20, Dublin; Baby Doherty, full term, unborn, Dublin; Patrick Fay, 47, Dublin and County Louth; Elizabeth Fitzgerald, aged 59, Dublin; Breatha Bernadette Grace, aged 34, Dublin and County Kerry; Archie Harper, aged 73, County Monaghan; Antonio Magliocco, 37, Dublin and Italy; May McKenna, aged 55, County Tyrone; Anne Marin, aged 20, County Sligo; Anna Massey, aged 21, Dublin; Dorothy Morris, aged 57, Dublin; John O'Brien, aged 24, Anna O'Brien, aged 22, Jacqueline O'Brien, 17 months, Anne-Marie O'Brien, 5 months, Dublin; Christina O'Loughlin, 51, Dublin; Edward John O'Neill, aged 39, Dublin; baby Martha O'Neill, stillborn, Dublin; Marie Phelan, 20, County Wexford; Siobhan Royce, 19, Wexford Town; Maureen Shields, 46, Dublin; Jack Travers, aged 28, Monaghan Town; Breatha Turner, 21, County Tipperary; John Walsh, aged 27, Dublin; Peggy White, 44, Monaghan Town; and George Williamson, aged 72, County Monaghan. Ceann Comhairle, these were ordinary people going about the business of their everyday lives in a city and in a town where they had no reason to feel unsafe. Then their precious lives were wiped out. For 50 years, for 5 decades, for half a century, their heartbroken loved ones have fought courageously for the truth and for justice that's still denied. And some of the families and more are in the public gallery with us this evening. We salute your bravery and resilience, and we stand with you now and always. The families have always gone toe-to-toe with the British state that has at every turn blocked the truth, withheld evidence, and prevented the release of important documents in relation to the bombings. It has pushed ahead the British government with callous amnesty legislation to shut down transparency, and the agenda is clear. While loyalist paramilitaries planted the bombs, they were aided by dark-hand agents of the British state. Collusion is no illusion. And yet the British state continues to deny that the bombings in Dublin and Monaghan were part of its dirty war in Ireland. These inspirational families have also been profoundly failed by this state. The initial Garda investigation was so limited in remit as to render it useless from the get-go. And incredibly, it was wrapped up by the August bank holiday of that same summer. Over the last 5 decades, successive Taoiseach have openly admitted that they have not raised this travesty with their British counterparts. Understandably, the families and survivors felt abandoned, dismissed, forgotten, and the absence of the truth hangs in the air around them. It casts a long shadow over their lives. Bernie McNally, who survived the blast on Talbot Street, said, "To deny people the truth is just so wrong, and it will never go away until it's righted. It will always be there. It will always be hanging over us all." This is the weight that the families and survivors carry around with them. The injustice and the contempt that they've faced for 50 years is woven through the fabric of their everyday lives. So it's now time to do right by the families and survivors. The British state must now provide all relevant information, evidence and documentation it holds in relation to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. The Irish government must insist and press upon the British government that this happens without any further delay. Count Corla, 50 years is a lifetime. Family members of those who died have passed away without ever knowing the truth. Other families have been born, have grown up with this injustice hardwired into their lives. So now is the time for the light of truth. Now is the time for justice for the forgotten.
Cancórla, on Friday the 17th of May 1974, 3 car bombs exploded in Dublin's city centre. Less than 90 minutes later, outside Greason's pub on the North Road, a 4th bomb exploded in Monaghan town. 34 lives were lost, including an unborn child. Nearly 300 were injured. Countless lives remain scarred physically and mentally to this day. On Friday, we will mark the 50 years since the massacre of Irish citizens by a death squad involving members of British state forces. It was the worst atrocity in this state since the Civil War. Friday's anniversary will be marked by wreath laying by the President, speeches by ministers, by Lord Mayors and Cathaoirleach. In recent years, we have seen the attendance of Taoiseach at commemorations. And tonight, I expect, will be the 4th occasion since 2008 that the Dáil has adopted, with cross-party support, a resolution supporting the campaign for truth and justice. And it would be easy, therefore, to get the impression now that this state has always stood with the victims and the survivors. Cancórla, unequivocally, that was not the case. I want to say that all those who lost loved ones or who were injured as a result of the conflict deserve access to the truth. Whether they were victims of British state forces, loyalist paramilitaries or the IRA, the pain is the same. There cannot be a hierarchy of victims. I hope everyone in this House shares that sentiment, because throughout those dark days and years there was a hierarchy. There was a different approach taken to different events and losses. Almost immediately after the bombs in Dublin and Monaghan detonated, people knew. They knew that British state forces were involved. The close sequence of the explosions, the technical features of the bombs, the components used, the calculated maximum impact, the timing, all pointed to a capability and resource that wasn't available to loyalist gangs without the direct support of British state agents. Any reasonable person would have expected that both the Irish and British governments and the Gardaí would move swiftly to apprehend the perpetrators and to assert the full facts. That didn't happen. In debates in this House immediately after the bombings, speakers seemed more concerned that those suspicions be deflected rather than addressed. Indeed, several politicians and some elements of the media over the years disgracefully sought to use these murders for their own narrow political agenda. In his report of a meeting of an engagement with the then Foreign Minister Gareth Fitzgerald, the British ambassador at the time reported that the predictable attempt by the IRA to pin the blame on the British has made no headway at all. The truth is that neither Dublin nor London made any serious attempt to pursue the perpetrators for years. The British government knew the identity of the perpetrators and claimed, in fact, to have interned them. They shared this information with the then Taoiseach ministers in September 1974. Nothing, it seems, was done with this information. It was left, in fact, to the families and victims to campaign, in the first instance to campaign for recognition. They alone and the friends they made along the way actually investigated what the authorities failed to do. A small number of journalists deserve great credit for lifting a lid on decades-old secrets, in particular, the 1993 Yorkshire television documentary Hidden Hand, The Forgotten Massacre ensured a new generation had the starting basis for a renewed campaign. But only a determined campaign by the families, by the victims and their friends eventually shifted attitudes in official Ireland. And I want to join with Deputy MacDonald in welcoming members and supporters of the campaign group Justice for the Forgotten here today, and to thank them for their relentless work on behalf of the victims for their service to the cause of truth and justice. Cancórla, I commend the motion to the House and I urge government to act upon it. I urge government to demand that the British government release all information pertaining to this attacks and all others perpetrated by the so-called Glennane gang, and in all instances where the British state or its agents colluded in attacks and murders on this island, north or south. To use every mechanism at government's disposal to exert pressure on the British government, including through multilateral and international fora, to finally do the right thing and come clean on its dirty war in Ireland. And for the Irish government in this 50th anniversary year to also acknowledge the failings of this state in the aftermath of the Dublin-Monaghan bombings and in the decades that followed. Thanks to the work of the people here and others, the victims of Dublin-Monaghan are no longer forgotten, but they have yet to secure justice.
Under 8 minutes left. Sorry, Deputy Pearson.
Friday will mark the 50th anniversary and 50th year since the 34 innocent lives were lost as a result of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. And as we heard, and hundreds injured also on that day. The Dublin-Monaghan bombings changed the lives of so many forever, not just those who were killed or indeed injured. And I want to acknowledge the presence, as my colleagues have, of some of the families of the victims, the Justice for the Forgotten campaign group, who have done so much in their campaign for truth and justice over the years. It is now undisputed, except for those with a modus operandi to hide the truth and frustrate justice, that the bombings were carried out by loyalists with the collusion of British security personnel. And that was a tactic that was deployed by the British state for decades and championed by Frank Kitson, using what he called counter-gangs to carry out the designs of British military, intelligence services and indeed government. To this day, the British government has refused to disclose the actions of its intelligence services, both in the wider conflict and with respect to the bombings on that fateful and tragic day. In 2005, the Committee on Justice was unequivocal in its conclusion when it said, "We are dealing with acts of international terrorism that were colluded in by the British security forces." The British Government's Legacy Act is indicative of their approach towards truth and justice and the lengths that they will go in order to protect themselves and the British state, with little regards to victims and their families. And this matter, these atrocities remain unsolved. So the motion before the House this evening calls on the Government to ensure that all requests made from Operation Denton to authorities in this jurisdiction are acted on as a matter of priority, and to urge and directly raise with the British Government the need to provide all relevant materials to investigators. This motion has received cross-party support, like the previous motions that were tabled and introduced by Sinn Féin in the past years, which were also unanimously adopted. But what is required is not simply words. We need actions. The families demand actions. Every victim is deserving of truth and justice, and that includes those who lost their lives in the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. So as we approach the 50th anniversary of these atrocities, it is time to redouble our efforts so that they and their families get what they deserve, truth and justice.
I first want to welcome the bereaved families to the gallery this evening, along with everyone involved with Justice for the Forgotten. You have my and these benches' support in your campaign for truth and justice. Your struggle for justice, despite the barriers that you have faced, is absolutely inspirational. Truth, as all families who have been impacted by the conflict will know, is incredibly important. Collusion was no illusion, as so many families have had to discover and experience through their own losses. We have had previous motions in front of this Dáil on this, the single greatest loss of life in the entirety of the conflict, with 27 victims in Dublin and 7 in Monaghan. But now, in this, the year of the 50th anniversary, and indeed the week of the 50th anniversary of these bombings, we have had the Legacy Act, which facilitates the perpetuation of cover-up and denial of truth and justice for families. It is essential, that the interstate case repeals this act. In recent weeks, we've seen in the cases of Sean Brown, Fergal McCusker and others whose inquests were closed with calls by coroners for public inquiries in cases of collusion, which again shows we need the interstate case to be successful and the act to be scrapped. We have a British government, even post-Good Friday Agreement, that has not delivered for victims' families and lived up to its responsibilities. We need to hear from the Irish government that you are on the side of families, and we need to hear from you this week, because the silence has been too much. Irish citizens whose lives have been destroyed as they're going through the trauma of the enacting of the Legacy Act, and all families impacted by the Dublin-Monaghan bombings and families impacted by the policy of British state collusion must hear in words and see in actions that this government is on their side and that it will do everything to secure the repeal of this act. The government must do more, and it must do everything in its power to support these families in their quest in truth and justice.
I welcome the opportunity to speak on this, the 50th anniversary of the awful bombings in Dublin and Monaghan. I also welcome to the gallery some members of the families of the 27 Dublin victims and the 7 who lost their lives in Monaghan, and also representatives of Justice for the Forgotten. The impact of the tragic events in Dublin and Monaghan still reverberates through every one of those 50 years, and despite several motions to this House since at least 2008, still no resolution. The horrific events of that sunny May day in 1974 and the innocent lives lost in Dublin and Monaghan will never be forgotten by any one of us who lived through them. Despite being in the full knowledge that those atrocities were carried out by loyalists, aided and abetted by British security personnel, successive British governments have denied the victims and their families the closure and justice they so richly deserve. Now, to add insult to injury, the passing of the callous legacy bill by the UK Parliament has copper-fastened the British government's unwillingness to be open and transparent. The Justice Barron report in 2005 was absolutely clear and apologetic in concluding that the events of May 17, 1974 were acts of international terrorism that were colluded in by British security forces, yet still after 50 long years, still neither the innocent victims nor their families have had even a hint of justice being done. I remember the events of that day as a child, my mother telling me about the O'Brien family, mother, father and 2 beautiful baby girls, all killed outright by the Parnell Street blast. Innocent lives lost, still waiting for the truth to be told. I implore all in this House to support this motion, calling on this government to leave no stone unturned, no avenue unexplored to ensure that this matter is no longer unresolved, to bring all possible pressure to bear on British government to provide full disclosure of all all requested documentation and material. All victims are equal, all innocent, all equally deserving justice. This government must do what their predecessors did not, and you must raise this minister with Minister Sunak. 50 years is far too long.
Good Margaret. I just have a couple of seconds, but I just want to wish the families well, and my thoughts are with you and all your loved ones. I want to thank the Justice for the Forgotten, the Pat Finucane Centre and Relentless for Justice for all their hard work over the years. You're a long time waiting on justice. We're not supposed to have a hierarchy of victims, but clearly in this case I don't think the Irish state has treated you very well. I genuinely believe that you will get justice, and I look forward to seeing you all on Friday.
Paul Donnelly.
I'd just like to also welcome the families here today. I was 5 years old when the bombs were detonated in Dublin and Monaghan, and I lived a short distance away in Sheriff Street. Growing up in the North Inner City, the impact of these bombings left a long legacy of fear in the North Inner City and the wider city of Dublin. What everyone knows is that this attack in Dublin and Monaghan was carried out by a combined group of British Army agents and loyalists with probable direct logistical support from British security services. What we all know is that there has never been a single person brought to justice. What we know is that the British state refused to release their files on who their agents were, what roles did their agents and members play in the attacks in Dublin and in Monaghan. It's inconceivable that, given that they had agents run into the very heart of loyalist groups right up until 1994, that the British state security services didn't know it was being carried out. And Mr Justice Barron, as has been mentioned earlier, was very critical of the Garda investigation, finding it limited, short of duration, and it was extraordinary investigation into an atrocity of this size and scale could or should be wound down so soon. So why was this investigation pulled after a number of weeks? I wonder, could the Taoiseach help explain that to the victims and their families and the people of Dublin and Monaghan? And I was listening to a podcast, the RTE podcast, and was stunned to hear that some witnesses have never been interviewed. And shockingly, one victim in Dublin said he was targeted for questioning about the bomb by the Gardaí. This man, even now, deserves an apology. I find it inexplicable that successive Irish governments failed to raise this with the British government over the years. It's time, 50 years on, that pressure is put on the British state to ensure that all material relevant to the work of the Operation Denton is provided to investigators. It's time for justice now. It's time for answers for the victims and their families, because justice delayed is justice denied.
Desi Ellis.
Friday next is the 50th anniversary of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. We remember the victims of one of the worst atrocities of the Troubles, when 3 bombs exploded in Dublin and a 4th one in Monaghan, resulting in the death of 34 civilians, including baby Martha O'Neill, and the injury of almost 300 people. I would like to pay tribute to the families and campaigners for justice for the forgotten here in the gallery, and acknowledge your long struggle for truth and justice, which is a testament to the commitment and determination to get justice for the loved ones 50 years on. Those who died that awful day were aged from 5 months to 80 years. Many who survived the bombings, as well as the families of the victims, still bear the physical and emotional scars of that day. Although the bombings were claimed by the UVF, they had all the hallmarks of collusion with the British Army and British intelligence. Irish Supreme Court Judge Henry Barron, in his report on the bombings in 2005, clearly indicated the likely involvement of the British military and the British intelligence services. This explains why the British government has been reluctant to release their files on these bombings, and why they have obstructed and frustrated the family's struggle for justice over the years. By continuing to withhold vital documents, they are willfully denying justice for the bereaved and the injured. It makes them more than just complicit in the denial of justice for the bereaved families and the injured, but it re-traumatises the survivors and the families of the victims. Various British governments use excuse of national security as a reason for not releasing their files. This is not about national security, it is about protecting the guilty. They are not interested or concerned with the victims of this atrocity. Their only concern is to hide their own involvement and protect their agents and personnel who work side by side with loyalists such as the Glennane gang. For the families and the survivors, justice delayed is justice denied.
And I'd like to join with my colleagues in acknowledging the presence of the families of some of the victims, as well as Justice for the Forgotten, who are present in the gallery, and extend my solidarity and sympathies to them. The 17th of May marks the 50th anniversary of the Dublin-Monaghan bombings, and 50 years on, and the families are still looking for truth and justice. It is important that this Dáil renews the mandates that were established by previous motions on the Dublin-Monaghan bombings, and it is welcome that it has been indicated that this motion will receive cross-party support here today. It is, however, important that the Government takes action to deliver on the core essence of this and previous motions. All victims are entitled to truth and justice, and the British Government's recently passed Legacy Bill is aimed at denying truth and justice and covering up the malevolent part they played in fuelling the conflict. We know that the bombings were carried out by loyalists and British agents with logistical and technical support from British security personnel, yet no one has ever been brought to justice, while the British Government maintains its denials and refuses to release files and information on the attacks. Previous Irish governments and institutions of this state do not have a proud record either when it comes to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. Anatomy of a Massacre, a new documentary to mark the 50th anniversary of the bombings, refers to the silent years between the bombings taking place and the early 1990s, when it was never raised by the government nor the opposition of the day, with the media compliantly ignoring it during this period also. Raising this matter in every meeting with the British Prime Minister should be a priority for any Taoiseach, yet too often previous Taoiseach were content to admit that they had not raised the matter. The Irish Government must use every diplomatic tool at its disposal to encourage the British to cooperate and release all relevant files. Truth and justice must be pursued and obtained.
We are dealing with acts of international terrorism that were colluded in by the British security forces. That's what the Oireachtas Committee on Justice said in 2005. That says it all. Let's be absolutely clear. Bombs ended up on the streets of Dublin and the streets of Monaghan, and we had 34 victims and their families that have been impacted for that huge period of time, and a huge amount of people injured. And this happened because of British state forces and their agents, and it was facilitated. And let's be absolutely clear that the reason that no one has looked into this to the degree that it needed to be outside of journalists and families, and I welcome the families here, I welcome all those that have fought hard for justice over many years, and justice that has been denied them to this date. But the fact is, the British government was never going to accept its role, the dirty war that it executed in Ireland. My own parents actually were getting the train to Dundalk 10 minutes before the bomb went off. They passed Talbot Street. One of their friends that they met there actually arrived in and was covered in, obviously, debris from the bombs. That is the sort of good luck that they had and the bad luck that others had. And obviously, loyalists showed a capacity that they didn't have before or after. We obviously need that those papers are released. And I would also make mention of Seamus Ludlow. I would also make mention of the Dundalk bombings. And I think we need to make sure that we look after those victims also. I'm thinking of Hugh Waters, I'm thinking of Jack Rooney, I'm thinking of the Glennane gang and the victims that they made that night also with their attack on Donnelly's Bar. Coordinated, controlled, and no justice for the families.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you. I help the English study.
Tá sé ábhar go bhfuil muid ag pléin ceiste an ábhar seo an nocht agus go bhfuil muid aontaithe tíofair an rúnatá ó chóirneamh ag Dáil leis an sladaí an fórsaí hasna agus Séránig a bhí Monaghan á maiile clé chuige bliain ó hain agus Muoinechan an aine ábharach sin. I want to salute the families and the campaigners, especially Margaret Irwin, who I know for many years, and Justice for Forgotten. Because when officialdom discouraged the families and those seeking justice and their supporters from delving into this, they continued. They continued seeking truth, and they fought hard and fast to try and get the media in this state in particular, but elsewhere, to look at the acts of international terrorism by the British forces against civilians on the streets of Dublin and Monaghan on May the 17th, 1974, and also in other attacks in 1972 and 73 in particular. They stood strong. The attacks by the British agents on May the 17th was tantamount to a declaration of war, aiming to strike terror in the Irish public, straight out of Kitson's War Manual, and people need to maybe go back and look at that. Many questions remain unanswered, and I welcome the new docu-film by Fergus Dowd and others, Autonomy of a Massacre, which is showing in the IFI at the moment, which highlight the failings of the Garda investigation, and those questions need answers. The British need to, once and for all, admit their role and admit the truth of their slaughter on the streets of Dublin and Monaghan.
Cronin.
I also want to welcome the families and the Justice for the Forgotten here to their Dáil this evening. We need to shine a bright light on these dark and dirty days on our island. Days when the dogs in the street knew the collusion between the British state forces and loyalist paramilitaries. Days when that reality, lived through and often died through, would not be spoken of in here, and in particular by those who brandished a very large political brush and a very large political carpet. 50 years on, and that carpet is shrunk and threadbare. No more brushing, no more airbrushing. Every file, every document must be released, no ifs or buts. 50 years on from the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, the need-to-know basis is that everything must be known, and everybody has the right to know it, and especially the families themselves. It would be a grave disservice to the families if we were to subject them to a superficial treatment of their loss. If we were to continue to subject them to fake emoting, professional empathy, while at the same time continuing to turn a political blind eye to the perpetrators, the colluders, and those who knew or suspected and said nothing or did nothing. Even now I sense a political rush to divert, supposedly to the pain of the families, instead of turning laser political and police attention on exposing the cause of that pain. Because they live that pain. They want the truth. Give it to them. I listened to the Taoiseach's speech. He has raised, he has written to the British government. He's been frank with the British government. He's pressing the British government. But in 50 years, this state has never conducted a public grilling of any key British figure, political or security. They have been green-roomed and red-carpeted. They have never, and including successive Irish governments, could do with a public grilling too. The evening of the bombings, I was a child waiting for my father to come home. I remember he was on duty that day in Dublin. He did come home, but for all those who did not, bring them truth and justice and bring it home to them now.
They say that peace is more than the absence of war, and 50 years ago, this country was in terrible turmoil and terrible death, was across the entire island, and all the lives that were lost in that conflict are, of course, a terrible loss and terrible tragedy to all of those families. 25 years ago, thankfully, we've had the Good Friday Agreement, and the promise of that agreement was that we would look at what the causes of war are. The causes of war is the absence of justice. And now here we are, 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and we are still not dealing with the problems of that conflict. And the real issue here is that the Irish state has not done enough, has simply not done enough to put pressure on the British state, but also within this state to provide the documents to the families and to their legal representatives. Here in this state we have action to take. We all know, and it has been mentioned here, that the people involved, the UVF involved, that there were members of the RUC and members of the UDR, both full-time and part-time involved. But there were also members of British military intelligence forces there who have a direct line back to Whitehall. And that is the reason why the British government do not want to expose this. Because it was British government policy in Ireland to support loyalists, to carry out these atrocities. That is why they refuse to engage, because it goes right to the heart of the British government's policy. And that is something which this government has to recognise and acknowledge. And indeed, if the British military intelligence services had such influence on loyalists at that time, we have to wonder, when we look at what happened with the Garda investigation and with the actions in this state, did they also have influence here? And is that part of the reasons for all of this? The families and the representative, and I know Margaret Irwin, I met her several times, it's one of the key contacts with the families in respect of all of this, has worked tirelessly for the last 25 years, have worked with every government and done everything and put every pressure on to try and ensure that we would get a solution. That has not happened. And that is the reality that they face. And while others here have said, that justice does not exist, we have to remain relentless. We cannot accept that. We cannot accept that there will not be a day when these families will get the truth. Because the truth can be hidden, but the truth does not change. The truth is the truth. These people deserve it. And this government has to step up to the mark and ensure that they deliver for them.
Deputy Conway Walsh.
Thank you very much. On the way up from Mayo this morning, I listened to the sister of Anne Marin from Sligo talk about the horror of the 17th of May in 1974, when her family waited for her at the other end in Sligo, waited for the train station, as many people do when people are returning from Dublin to rural Ireland. And she described what the other families had gone through as well. And I want to welcome the families here to be with us this evening, and also the relatives, the Justice for the Forgotten. And I do want to commend the Relatives for Justice and the Pat Finucane Centre. And I just wonder, as I'm sitting here, where would we be without them? The truth that they have laid bare over the last number of years, we certainly owe them a debt of gratitude. We've had 50 years of waiting for the truth of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, 50 years of cover-up, 50 years of denial, and 50 years of having doors shut in their grieving faces, 50 years of files shut tight. Those files must now be released. The British government must be upfront and honest as to the role that its intelligence services played in the conflict and in the collusion. The Irish government must answer the failings of this state and the cover-ups and the unexplained actions and no actions that were taken at all. Raising this matter must be a priority for any Taoiseach in every meeting with their counterpart in Britain. And I'll just finally say, because I've run out of time, to add insult to injury, the British government now presenting an independent public history of the Troubles is an insult to everybody across this island.
Cahirlock, there aren't too many issues that would secure all party support for a motion on 4 occasions: 2008, 2011, 2016 and now 2024. Some might say it's surprising that virtually the same motion needs to be brought before the House on 4 separate occasions. But actually the most surprising aspect of it all was that it took 34 years for the first motion to actually be brought here. I think that in itself is telling. What I hope that we can offer to the families, to the campaigners who join us here tonight, is that on this occasion, this motion will be matched and met with action. I want to thank all the members of the House who contributed to this debate, particularly all the members of the opposition. I want to thank the government representatives, particularly Deputy Smith, who was the only member representing either Monaghan or Dublin from government that participated in this debate. The truth is that the British government murdered Irish citizens. Sometimes they did it quite overtly, including the murder of children, including the murder of Aidan McAnesby as he went to a football match from my county to his neighbouring Tyrone. But in most instances, they did it covertly. They did it in collusion with loyalists, with unionist death squads, with armed groups. In some instances, nobody claimed responsibility, but it was a key part of a British government strategy. And as others have said, it is the reason why the files won't be opened on this particular case unless the British government are forced to, because when the files are opened on this particular case, the entire British colonial strategy becomes exposed, because the actions of the British government in Ireland weren't unique to Ireland. They were unique to, they were part of the colonial playbook all across the world where Britain was active. And that's why the truth of collusion needs to be spoken. Because for a long time in this House and across official Ireland, collusion was presented as Republican propaganda. It was given no succour. Anybody who dared to suggest was likely to get a visit from the Garda Special branch. And that was part of the core aim of successive governments. So after Dublin-Monaghan, after the other bombings in Dublin, after the bombing of Casablanca, after the bombing of Belturbet, after the bombing of Dundalk, after the murder of John Francis Green, after all of the acts in this state that the British government had a hand in, the instinctive purpose, objective of governments here in Dublin was to ensure that it doesn't lead to an increase in support for republicanism. That was the basis on which decisions were taken, not the need to secure truth and justice for those people who had been bereaved. The key policy objective was censorship. It was ensuring that the conflict, as was considered in Dublin, was contained in the north. All I can say, Cahirlock, all I can say is thank God for people like these. Thank God for people like Relatives for Justice, for people like the Pat Finucane Centre for Justice for the Forgotten, because it's their tenacity, it's their determination, it's their absolute belief that their loved ones would not become forgotten that has ensured that official Ireland had to change tack. And I want to thank them again. We have to say with one voice across all political parties, across all sides in this House, that Britain must be held accountable for the actions of its agents in Ireland. But I think we also need to say that this House, this state, also needs to be held accountable for its failure to this point to hold Britain accountable. I want to just retort to one of the contributions, and I thank him for his contribution. But Brendan Howlin was a member of government in 2014 when the Stormont House Agreement was actually passed by all parties in the north and by both governments. The only signatory to that agreement that has failed in any way to live up to their responsibilities in respect of transparency and accountability and truth and justice is the British government. This is going to be a stressful and emotional week for the families of Dublin and Monaghan. But I also hope it's going to be a week of vindication. And I want to, in my final remarks, just to say thank you to Margaret Irwin in particular. All of these people deserve great credit, but Margaret Irwin has been a true champion for the families of justice for the forgotten, and we owe her and all of those who have campaigned for truth and justice a debt of gratitude. I commend the motion to the House.